Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones, Standards Plus History Academy. And it is Thursday morning, almost through another week. And we are continuing with our Watergate series, which is, believe it or not, going to lead back to JFK at some point. And today we're going to be looking at the topic of Larry O'Brien. And of course, if you've been following this and if you're familiar with Watergate, you know Larry O'Brien was the DNC chairman. It was his office the Watergate burglars were in when they were caught. He's pictured here on the far right. And we're going to talk about his background. These three guys, basically Richard Nixon, obviously, top left, Larry O'Brien, far right, and then Howard Hughes at the bottom. And the I got to begin with this. To understand the connection between Watergate and the JFK assassination, one has to understand the relationship uh, between Nixon and Howard Hughes and what Larry O'Brien knows about that relationship. If I just come at it starting in 1960, when we that's where we are headed. But if I just start there, it's going to appear as if that relationship just happened out of thin air. This relation predates 1960, goes back to Nixon's beginnings in Congress in the mid 40s. So the that's what we're going to talk about today is the backstory to 1960, so that when we get into the 1960 deal between Nixon and Howard Hughes, it makes sense. So today is the backstory to the relationship. And of course, the question is, what did Larry O'Brien know? Because obviously, and it's not necessarily what he knew for sure. It's what Nixon thought he knew, which causes all the problem. So first, a little bit about Howard Hughes. Of course, Howard Hughes is a man of mystery, but he is, he's sort of a modern day Renaissance man. I've kind of compared him to Elon Musk in a way. He very rich, you know, billionaire, inventor, you know, had his hands in a lot of different things, very intellectually curious. He was an aviator, as you can see here on the left. He owned his own airline, Hughes West Airline. He was a filmmaker. He owned a Hollywood studio, romanced all the Hollywood starlets. He was always seen with somebody, some eye candy on his arm. And he inherited from his father a bunch of oil drilling patents, government defense contracts, and gambling casinos, and then took it to the next level. And he was also a megalomaniac. He kind of a power hungry guy, thought he could buy anybody. Told Robert Mayhew, his attorney, "You just remember that I, Howard Hughes, can buy any man in the world, or I can destroy him." And that's how he operated. He that's how he came to know Richard Nixon, as you will see. Uh, so the relationship between Nixon and Hughes begins in 1945 when Nixon begins running for Congress, and Hughes makes a contribution, and Nixon wins his first congressional seat in 46, and the relationship blossomed from there. During the 40s and 50s, when Nixon was on his anti-communist bent, he was, leading HUAC, the hearings on American activities. Nixon was kind of the point person in that. So, you know the story about him and going after the the Russian spy, or you know, it, it was Nixon who was leading that effort, and Hughes was a big fan, and Nixon was a big fan of Hughes because Hughes' movie studio, RKO Pictures, took legal action against one of the screenwriters who refused to answer questions before Nixon's committee. If you know the story of the Hollywood 10, Nixon's committee, HUAC, was charging people with contempt and stuff if they wouldn't give names up and putting them in jail. a Supreme Court event. And the Hollywood 10 was a group of Hollywood folks saying, we're not going to play your game. We're not giving up names. And so they got put in jail. Eventually, the Supreme Court ruled against the committee in favor of the Hollywood 10. It says you can't use jail to leverage people or information out of people. And anyway, so one of them, Paul Jericho, was a screenwriter. He'd refused to answer questions before HUAC. And, Nixon took that personal. That was his committee. And so Hughes uh, took legal action against Paul Jericho. And Nixon declared later, Hughes deserved the approval of every man and woman who believes that forces of subversion must be wiped out. This is the height of the Cold War and the Red Scare and you know, McCarthyism and all that kind of stuff. And Nixon was caught up in it. And so was Hughes. So they shared a common interest when it comes to communism, as far as that was concerned. They wanted to root out all the communists in the State Department and government and Hollywood, everywhere. All right, well, in 1956, about 10 years after this relationship starts, Nixon and Hughes are friendly enough that Nixon requests of Hughes a $205,000 loan to his brother. $205,000 in 1956 is a ton of money. And Don Nixon, Richard's brother, was trying to establish a hamburger joint in LA, and he was going to sell this, quote, Nixon burger. And this was, capitalizing on the Nixon name, kind of like you see going on today in the highest levels of power. Everybody's trying to capitalize on their name. But he needed some investment up front, so he asked Hughes for a $205,000 loan. And Hughes gives it to him. And of course, the venture fails. It doesn't work out. Hughes, $205,000 evidently is nothing to him. He didn't care. He told the top aide, quote, it's a chance to cement a relationship. So he's looking at doing, this family business. This goes back forever. People act like what Joe Biden is doing right now with his son, Hunter. It's the first time it's ever happened. Nixon was doing this with his brothers going back in the mid 50s, getting perks for his brothers. It's all because of a relationship that Hughes is trying to nurture with Richard Nixon, because he sees him going places. And sure enough, weeks later, Richard has a chance to thank Howard Hughes the way he can, and the IRS reversed a ruling on a questionable tax shelter, which they had previously ruled on was going to cost Howard Hughes millions of dollars. They reversed themselves, no doubt as a result of some arm twisting by Richard Nixon. He also, not long after, received favorable rulings from the Civil Aeronautics Board and the Justice Department on regulatory and antitrust matters, and earned Howard Hughes millions more. So what we're seeing here is an investment both ways. Howard Hughes is investing in Nixon's early career, and the payoff is coming as a result of Nixon's position and power, where he can twist a few arms, get some decisions reversed or changed or made that favor Howard Hughes, and all of a sudden, $205,000 doesn't look like that big of a loan. It's a small investment Howard Hughes is making in Nixon's political future. And then we get to 1960, and Nixon's running for president. And Larry O'Brien, who is running, he's involved in the JFK campaign, found out about, he's a Democrat operative. We'll get to him in a minute, but basically he's a Democrat operative, and he helps with the JFK campaign. And he was brilliant. He ran that campaign brilliantly. Anyway, he found out about that $205,000 loan. Of course, JFK's running against Nixon. And he got close to a Howard Hughes accountant, paid him a large sum of money. He says, I'll pay you a bunch of money if you'll turn over the incriminating documents. It's not good enough just to have your say so. I want the documents. So they consummate the transaction. He takes those documents and passes them off to a couple friends of his, one in particular, Jack Anderson and Drew Pearson. These are the two preeminent political columnists of the day, and they're muckrakers. A muckraker is, they're always looking for a scoop. They're always looking to dig up dirt. And boy, here's some dirt on one of the big presidential candidates. And so they wrote a series of stories. And here you see pictured Drew Pearson headline: Columnist links Nixon and Hughes to large loan. This ran in many newspapers and broadcast outlets, and it severely damaged Nixon's reputation. Now, this isn't the first time that Nixon has been accused. In 52, when he was running for vice president under Eisenhower, that's when he gave his famous checkers speech, because again, he was accused of taking big cash payouts and using some of that money for personal reasons, and he had to give the checkers speech to save himself. So here he is, some more financial shenanigans involving Nixon and a political contributor, this time in 1960. Well, he loses that election, and Nixon, to the day he died, blamed that close loss in 60 on the Hughes story. And then in 62, when he runs for governor of California, the story gets resurrected and he loses again. You know, Nixon was a political superstar when he started. He wins Congress in 46. Shortly thereafter, he runs for the first Senate seat. He wins that. He gets reelected. And then, boom, in 52, Eisenhower picks him up to be his VP. They win 2 terms consecutively. He's never lost. That's why these people are glomming onto him. This guy's like a shooting star in the Republican Party. He comes from California, the biggest state. So they're glomming onto him. And then all of a sudden, this Hughes connection comes out. He loses 60, and then he loses the California governor's race, which this is after this race is when Nixon comes out and he's kind of feeling sorry for himself. And he tells the media, you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. He's kind of feeling sorry for himself. And he's basically telling everybody he's dropping out of politics, which of course he doesn't. But in that moment, that's how he felt. And even the governor who beat him, Edmund Brown, later says, the reason I beat Nixon in 62 for the governor's race is because of that magazine article about the Hughes loan. So, this isn't just Nixon saying this. Even his opponent thinks this. Well, now we fast forward to 68. So he loses 60, he loses 62. Now we fast forward to 68. Nixon's been out of government. But times have changed. The Vietnam War has gone badly. LBJ is a prisoner in the White House. He's decided not to run again. Hubert Humphrey hasn't jumped in the race yet. You got Eugene McCarthy basically on the Democrat side, and eventually Bobby will jump in. But the Democrat Party appears to be in some sort of disarray at the moment. Dick Nixon decides to get in. There's no Bobby yet. It's just basically Eugene McCarthy. And then on the Republican side, there's just like a power vacuum. There's nobody. And so all of a sudden Nixon starts to look like, maybe we can try this again, make a comeback. And Howard Hughes tells his top lawyer, Robert Mayhew, he sees, quote, a really valid possibility of a Republican victory that could be realized under our sponsorship and supervision every step of the way. I mean, it doesn't take a real genius reading the tea leaves to see opportunity for Republican in that setting. It has been a Democrat in office since 60, and it has been a Democrat who's presided over a very unpopular war, which in 68, protesters they've camped up around the White House. That's why LBJ can't even leave the White House. So if you're a pro-war candidate, which Democrat Party is basically sponsoring this war at this point. And if you're a pro-war candidate, you've got strong headwinds. And you know how our country lurches back and forth anyway. Last 8 years has been under Democrat rule. We've had, this very unpopular war, and people are dodging the draft, and body bag kids are coming home in body bags. We've had it's not a great time to be an incumbent. That's what I'm trying to say. So yeah, it is a good time to be a Republican running for president. So Howard Hughes makes his bet on his racehorse. And he says, I'm going to give $50,000 to the Nixon campaign. It was legal. It was a totally legal donation. But this is a strong indicator where people like Howard Hughes, the money people in the country, are saying to these potential candidates, you need to, this is your chance. And I will help you. And, it's all about helping themselves. And Nixon is his guy, has been his guy. He's been out of politics for a while. So this is Howard Hughes kind of revitalizing Nixon, saying, all right, back at it, big guy. And Howard Hughes tells Mayhew to, quote, see Nixon as my special confidential emissary. And he says, this is a, boy, if this doesn't explain the relationship between Howard Hughes and Richard Nixon, I don't know what does. He says, quote, this isn't charity. If we select Nixon, we're picking him. We're running this guy as our guy. Then he, I know for sure, knows the facts of life. Okay, so I'm going to give him money. We're going to get him into the White House, and he knows the facts of life. He knows it's his turn to pay us back, and there will be a payback. So we advance a year, and Nixon has won. It was a close election. He barely beat Hubert Humphrey, but he wins. So now Howard Hughes's man is in the White House. And so they want to nurture this relationship beyond, I guess, so that Nixon will pick up the phone anytime their representative calls. And of course, it can't be Howard Hughes and Richard Nixon direct to direct. They're going to go through an emissary. So Mayhew hires an old friend of his and a guy he knew from the FBI. Mayhew used to be in the FBI himself. And his name is Richard Banner. And he's got two jobs. He says, your first job is to manage this casino in Las Vegas in your off hours, but your main job is to manage the relationship between Howard Hughes and the Nixon White House. So you're going to be my liaison, kind of like Johnny Rosselli was the liaison between the mafia and the CIA, the middle guy. Richard Banner is going to serve that relationship for Howard Hughes and Richard Nixon. Banner had plenty of experience with people that knew Nixon. He had been city manager of Miami back in the 40s, and he had become very close friends with a Cuban-American businessman named Bebe Rebozo. Bebe Rebozo is pictured here with Richard Nixon. You see him on the Richard Nixon's on the right, Bebe Rebozo is on the left. And both of these guys, Banner and Rebozo, had been introduced to Nixon in the 50s. So what Mayhew is doing smartly is he's picking somebody to handle the relationship between Howard Hughes and Nixon, somebody that Nixon already knows, and somebody who is very familiar with another guy that Nixon knows, Bebe Rebozo. And, this helps grease the skids, so to speak, when you can pick people to act as these emissaries that you have a prior relationship with. In 68, going back a year when they were still running for president, Banner worked on the Nixon campaign. So, Nixon's going to be very receptive to Banner. This guy put in his time on his campaign. And while he was working on the campaign, he and Rebozo, they were already laying the groundwork for this money pipeline, this money spigot from Hughes. They were talking with a Hughes lawyer about future campaign contributions, setting up this relationship between Howard Hughes and the new Nixon administration. So after Nixon wins and Mayhew begins putting all this together, it's kind of already been organized. They were already talking. They couldn't make anything official because Nixon wasn't president yet. Well, now he is. And so they set all this up, and Nixon begins as president making some decisions that benefit Howard Hughes almost immediately. In 1969, he approves Howard Hughes' purchase of Air West. You see one of these planes here, top right, it was called the Hughes Air West airline. And in 1970, his attorney general worked out an antitrust exemption so that Howard Hughes could buy a bunch of Las Vegas hotels, including the Flamingo, the famous Flamingo. And then a little bit later, the Treasury Department declined to enforce its tax regulations on Hughes holdings, which saved Howard Hughes, according to Jack Anderson, saved Hughes tens of millions of dollars. So what's happening is clearly obvious. They've got this relationship with Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes helped put Nixon in the White House. And then they put together this pipeline so that Howard Hughes money can continue to flow to Nixon through friends of Nixon, Banner and B.B. Rebozo. And so now that that's all established, Nixon in his position of influence is now twisting arms and doing things as president to help Howard Hughes and his business empire. It's all very cozy. It's all very friendly. It's all very financially lucrative for both sides. It's working for both sides. That's how these relationships work. So here's a larger blow up of that same picture, Nixon and Rebozo down in Miami somewhere. So Howard Hughes repays Nixon the way he always repays Nixon, with money. So he authorized Mayhew to deliver $50,000 cash to Rebozo. Now, this is not legal. This is not a campaign contribution. This is $50,000 cash. And then in the spring of 70, after the antitrust ruling came down through the attorney general, and Nixon's attorney general, John Mitchell, he arranges for another $50,000 in cash. And he takes it straight out of his casino vaults. He owns all these casinos, and it's, if you're the owner, it's a cash business. It's a pretty easy skim. So he takes $50,000, gives it to Rebozo. Then he gets the antitrust ruling, which benefits him more millions of dollars. $50,000 is peanuts to Howard Hughes. So total now he's given $100,000 of cash to Rebozo. And you say, well, what's Rebozo doing with this money? Rebozo is administering a secret slush fund for Nixon. Now, this is going to come into play when we get to Watergate, and Nixon has all this money to pay these Watergate burglars. According to Bob Haldeman, Nixon told him in 76, right, this is going forward a few years, that, quote, there was much more money in BB's $10 than the Hughes $100,000. Haldeman's assistant, Lawrence Higbee, testified that his boss, Nixon, had spoken of a, quote, Lawrence Higbee is reporting this, saying that Haldeman said this. So evidently Haldeman heard it from Nixon, that there is a secret, quote, $400,000 secret fund that's controlled by Rebozo. On April 17th, 1973, this is during the height of the Watergate scandal, Nixon actually told Haldeman and Ehrlichman to accept, quote, $200,000 to $300,000 toward their legal fees. He said, no strain, doesn't come out of me. As a matter of fact, I told BB basically, be sure that people who have contributed money over the contributing years are favored, and so forth in general. And he's used it for the purpose of getting things out, paid for in check and all that sort of thing. So here's BB Rebozo is a key guy in this. He's, once Nixon wins the White House, B.B. Rebozo and Richard Banner are brought into the Nixon inner circle. Richard Banner is to handle the relationship between Howard Hughes and the Nixon White House. He's the middleman. And then you got this other guy, B.B. Rebozo, who's handling all the money. So the money's not going to Banner. That would be too obvious. So you got this other guy who's handling all the money that Howard Hughes is funneling in the direction of Nixon. And according to Haldeman and Higbee, he's got a lot more money than just the $100,000 that Howard Hughes is giving him. He's getting money from other sources as well. So it paints a picture of Nixon, kind of like, the Joe Biden of the 70s. He's profiteering off his name and his position, his powerful job, and people are funneling cash. I guess it's an open secret. If you get cash to Nixon, he'll work on your behalf, and all of a sudden rulings will come out of Washington that favor your business. So he's got this $10 that B.B. Rebozo is controlling. Probably the main source of income is Howard Hughes, but there's other sources as well. The bottom line is no one can ever find out about this slush fund. BB's slush fund represents an enormous political liability for Nixon if it's ever discovered. That seems obvious, right? All right, so let's talk about O'Brien and all of this. Here's a picture of O'Brien. Nixon had a lot of respect for O'Brien. He recognized the political animal when he saw one. And the result of the 1960 campaign, him losing to JFK when he started off as the favorite. You're talking about Nixon being the sitting vice president in a very popular administration. And he loses to a political upstart, JFK. And that whole campaign, the architect of it was this guy, Larry O'Brien. So Nixon has a lot of respect for him, even though he knows he was cheated out of the election and he suspects that Hughes story, but he knows that Hughes story was leaked by this guy. So he knows this guy is a, quote, grandmaster in the art of political gamesmanship, which is code for saying, boy, this guy knows how to play dirty. In mid 68, remember now, after 60, Nixon's out of politics for a little bit, loses that 62 California gubernatorial election. In mid 68, when Nixon's coming back and running, O'Brien, who's been a Democrat Party operative ever since Kennedy won, Howard Hughes hires him to be his DC lobbyist. So, Howard Hughes we already learned, he thinks he can buy anybody or destroy anybody. And he's looking around in Washington. He's 68's when he's starting to game out his mind. How can we get back in the middle of how can we get back in Washington pulling the strings? Oh, I know. We'll make campaign contributions to a Republican because it looks like it's a Republican year. Well, who's my Republican that I own already? Oh, it's Nixon. So here's $50,000, Nixon. It's time for you to run. And they begin putting together the infrastructure of a relationship that's going to, if Nixon wins, with Richard Banner and Bibi Rebozo, and then he needs a lobbyist. And so he pays O'Brien $180,000 a year retainer to be his on-call DC lobbyist. So O'Brien's doing two things simultaneously here. He's still a Democrat Party operative. So you see how Howard Hughes is playing both sides here. He's got his Republican candidate he's backing, but he's got the guy who's sort of the kingmaker of the Democrat Party. He's backing him. He's on his, he's got him on his payroll. So he's got both sides covered. And O'Brien then sets out to resurrect Hubert Humphrey's 1968 campaign. So, you're covered either way if you're Howard Hughes. You're paying the guy who's helping the Democrat candidate, and you're making contributions to the Republican candidate. This is how the game is played. So Howard Hughes really doesn't care, I guess, who wins the election in 68. He's got both sides covered. Well, O'Brien, during that 68 campaign, goes back to pit bull mode and starts demanding investigations. Democrats control the levers of power at this point until the election. And so he begins demanding investigations that are coming out as a result of these columns that are written by Jack Anderson, his friend that he leaked information to in 60. And Jack Anderson is all over some of these scandals early on in the Nixon. This is after Nixon wins. Okay. So Humphrey is out. O'Brien is now getting the $180,000 to act on Howard Hughes' behalf. But he's also kind of underhandedly leaking information to Jack Anderson and then putting pressure on the Justice Department to investigate some of these, like this $400,000 bribe that Jack Anderson wrote about, and in order to win a favorable antitrust ruling. It's called the ITT affair. And yeah, sure enough, Jack Anderson writes about it. It's hugely embarrassing to the Nixon administration. And it turns out to be what everybody thought was the biggest scandal in the Nixon administration, which later be eclipsed by the Watergate scandal. But this is what O'Brien's doing. He's stirring that pot. He's in Washington. He's getting paid by Hughes, and he's still a Democrat operative at heart. Okay. And so anything the Nixon administration does, if he gets any scuttlebutt about it, he's relaying that information. He's leaking it to Anderson. The article comes out, and then he goes out and he says, hey, there needs to be an investigation, as if he didn't leak the information to begin with to Jack Anderson. So they got this little thing going on. And meanwhile, Nixon finds out about O'Brien's relationship with Howard Hughes. And we'll talk about how he finds out in a minute. But and he's thinking, how can I, this guy is a thorn in my side. And as long as he's in Washington, he's going to remain a thorn in my side. And here he is playing two games. He's pretending to be, a Democrat operative, and he eventually gets promoted to chairman of the Democrat National Committee. So he's got that job. And then on the side, he's working for Howard Hughes. And boy, if there's any way I could expose that Howard Hughes connection, that would really discredit O'Brien. And so this begins what the Nixon White House and the plumbers are eventually going to call the Operation O'Brien. Nixon's going to be searching for a way to neutralize this adversary in Washington who keeps leaking all these stories to Jack Anderson, who's worked against him now twice in the 60 campaign and 68. As long as he's around, he's a problem for Nixon. And now it turns out he's getting paid by the same guy Nixon's getting paid by. It gets kind of confusing. It's very incestual, all this stuff. So but there's an opportunity here, but there's also a threat. And the threat is, what does O'Brien know? Because O'Brien, if Nixon knows that O'Brien is on Hughes' payroll, there's a good chance that O'Brien knows that Nixon too is on Howard Hughes' payroll. And so you got to soft pedal this. You got to be clever in how you do this. Because yes, there's an opportunity. If you can track down proof that O'Brien is connected to Hughes, you could really embarrass him, but he could turn the tables on you and do the same to you. So it's a dangerous game. So he unleashes his political pit bull named Murray Chotiner, pictured here with Nixon. He's a political consultant. Basically, Nixon says, you go find whatever derogatory information you can find on O'Brien and leak it. We got to keep the heat on the DNC and O'Brien. By this point, O'Brien is head of the DNC. So in January of 71, Nixon reveals to Bob Haldeman how he found out that O'Brien is in bed with Howard Hughes. And he found out from his good friend in Miami, Rebozo. By the way, if you remember, Nixon was in Miami with Rebozo on the night of the Watergate burglary. That's when he had to fly back to Washington. So Rebozo and him are tight. And Rebozo told him, hey, I don't know if you know this or not, but this guy that's a problem for you in Washington, he's getting paid by the same guy you're getting paid by. And so he tells Haldeman, he says, quote, it might be time to hold O'Brien accountable for his retainer with Howard Hughes by planting damaging stories in the press. So that's the agenda. We're going to try to get derogatory information, incriminating information about O'Brien. We're going to leak it to the press. That's what he's been doing. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. He's been killing me with these stories. Jack Anderson's been killing me with these stories that he's getting. His source is O'Brien. So let's do it. Let's play the game. I mean, works for them. Why couldn't it work for us? All right, that was January 71. You fast forward to August 72. This is 2 months after the Watergate break-in, which happened in June. Nixon turns up the heat on O'Brien. They get caught trying to steal information out of the DNC offices. The burglars get caught. And this ongoing operation, it started Operation O'Brien in January of 71. They're trying to get all this derogatory information on O'Brien. They've been busted. And so August of 72, Nixon, this goes to the abuse of power that Nixon was exercising. He eventually gets charged in the impeachment hearings on, where he demands that the IRS audit O'Brien. And so he's got that going, and he's pressing his staff, keep digging, whatever information you can find out O'Brien, keep digging. We got to dirty him up. We got to dirty up O'Brien. And he actually says to him, quote, if anybody brings up that goddamn Hughes loan again, I'll break this over O'Brien's head. Clearly, Nixon is obsessed with O'Brien. He can't say no. This is why when Richard Helms comes to him and says, hey, I hear you're thinking about a special investigative unit. I got the perfect guy for you, E. Howard Hunt. And, this is what he does. And, Nixon, the idea of having his own special investigative unit is really appealing to him because up till then, he's been relying on J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover won't move fast enough for him. Now he's relying on Bob Haldeman and some of his staffers. And they got day jobs and they're bound by certain ethical constraints working in the White House and stuff. And you can see Nixon's brain, how it's working. And he's getting just more and more frustrated with O'Brien as these stories keep coming out in the Washington Post and other New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. Now, here's where B.B. Rebozo tries to slow Nixon down a little bit. He says, hey, we got to be careful here. He says there's a certain delicacy to this because, this has got to be handled right because, of quote, the delicacy of the relationship is a result of our own dealings with the Hughes people. And he's talking about those $100,000 cash payoffs that were made to Nixon through Rebozo. He's saying, hey, this could blow back on us. And he said, it's not just that, Mr. President. He said that we got an issue with, Robert Mayhew is Howard Hughes' top aide. I don't know if you realize this or not, but Robert Mayhew is best friends with Larry O'Brien. So that may be a pipeline of information that, that's a pipeline we don't have. And they could trump us here. And as Howard Hughes' top aide, Mayhew is the guy who forwards all of Hughes' political contributions. So that gives Mayhew direct knowledge of any money that Howard Hughes is paying to any political candidate, whether right or left. And we've already seen he's paying both sides, but he knows he knows the skeletons in the closet. He knows who's getting that money. And if Mayhew chooses to do so, if there's any reason for him to do it, if there's any kind of push in that direction, he could confide in O'Brien. And we've already seen what O'Brien does with that information. He takes it right to Jack Anderson. So we wonder where O'Brien's getting all his information. It might be Mayhew. Now, originally, there was no fear of Mayhew, and I'll explain why in just a minute. But things change, and now the White House has to start thinking about Mayhew differently. And we'll explain that in just a second. But B.B. Rebozo is talking to Nixon. He's saying, quote, there is a serious risk here for a counter scandal. Any forced embarrassment of O'Brien in the matter of Howard Hughes might shake loose Republican skeletons from the closet. This is obvious, right? And, Nixon's team's already blaming O'Brien for leaking the Howard Hughes story to Drew Pearson and Jack Anderson back in 60. And he's thinking now ahead to 72. He's like, boy, he is in a prime position to do it all over. He's going to do it to me again in 72. He's the DNC chair. He's got this pipeline of information. It comes from Mayhew, which comes straight out of Howard Hughes. Mayhew's the number 2. So anything Hughes gives me, Mayhew knows. And so Mayhew can tell O'Brien, O'Brien can tell Jack Anderson or Drew Pearson. And that's what we're going to be facing again. And he's just, but B.B. Rebozo is saying, be careful. And here's where things get complicated. In normal times, Mayhew would not have been a problem because Mayhew in that position as number 2 understood how to be discreet. He understood how his boss played the game. This is a picture here of Howard Hughes on the left and Mayhew on the right. And he understood, okay, this is my boss feathering his nest, figuring out a way to grease the skids for his empire. And he's paying political candidates from both sides. So in the position that Mayhew was in the know, he had to be discreet about that. You just keep that to yourself. But these are not normal times anymore. He's no longer bound to be discreet because in December of 1970, Mayhew had lost a power struggle that had gone on internally within the Hughes empire. and he got fired. And he wasn't happy about it. He left on bad terms. And when he got fired, he filed a $50 million lawsuit against the Hughes business empire, against Howard Hughes, his former boss. So now he has an axe to grind, and he's free. He's a free agent. He can do or say whatever he wants now. He's not bound by anything. And he actually has some motive to want to hurt Hughes in some way. And what better way to hurt Hughes than to start revealing that Howard Hughes has been paying cash payments to Nixon, the president, which is going to hurt Nixon, probably cause him to lose. And now to somebody that Hughes doesn't have on the payroll, and now Hughes is out. That's a way to hurt him. And so Bibi Rebozo is explaining all of this to Nixon. And he says, not only does Mayhew know what happened in the past, he took with him a bunch of documents, memos that he and Howard Hughes exchanged back and forth, detailing all the wheeling and dealing that's been going on for all the time that Mayhew was Hughes number two. He's got the paperwork, he's got the documents. And it turns out Mayhew's not just friends with O'Brien, he's friends with Jack. Jack Anderson was the most connected columnist I've ever seen. I mean, this guy knows everybody. And Mayhew was friends with him. So he's saying, well, he really didn't even have to use O'Brien. Mayhew could just go straight to the guy, straight to Jack Anderson, and tell Jack Anderson himself. And turns out Larry O'Brien had also been fired in that power struggle. So he lost that $100,000 a year retainer with Howard Hughes. So now he's free to do or say whatever he wants, right? As long as he is a power broker, a lobbyist for Hughes, he's got to be really careful how he leaks damaging information about Hughes. Well, he doesn't have to be careful anymore. So not only do you have that on top of all of this, Mayhew is also angry at the White House because at the urging of Howard Hughes, after he fired Mayhew, Nixon turned the IRS loose on Mayhew to have him audited. I mean, you just can't make this stuff up. So this is why Bibi Rebozo is appealing to Nixon, saying you might want to be careful about going after O'Brien. Operation O'Brien leads back to Mayhew. They're friends. They're best friends. If you anger O'Brien, he's going to get back at you. And the best way, and he knows how to do that. He knows somebody who knows our deepest secrets. And not only does he know this person be willing to tell him, the person has documents. And his name is Mayhew. And both of these guys know Jack Anderson. So they're prime, they are in a prime position. They are placed perfectly to get the information, to leak the information to Anderson. Anderson will write about it and hurt two people simultaneously. Hurt Hughes, which is what Mayhew wants to do, and hurt Nixon, which is what O'Brien wants to do. Of course, O'Brien probably wants to hurt Hughes too. So it's a win-win-win all the way around. And so Bibi Rebozo is telling Nixon, man, you got to be careful. You got to be really careful here. Well, sure enough, inevitably, Jack Anderson strikes again in 71 with the help of Mayhew and his documents. The muckraker exposes Nixon's 52 slush fund. This is the same guy who had exposed the original slush fund in 52. Now exposes the $100,000 cash payments that Howard Hughes had made to Mayhew, who had then passed the money on to Rebozo on behalf of Richard Nixon. So here is Jack Anderson. This is the third time. The third time he's busted Nixon. He got him in 52. Nixon bailed himself out with the checker speech. He got him in 56, which cost Nixon the 60th election. And now he's got him again in 71, which is right before the 72 election. This is always happening at election time. In 52 is right before Nixon and Eisenhower run for president. Nixon's running for VP. Eisenhower briefly thought about dropping his vice president. It was causing a lot of problems, a lot of drag on the ticket. He saved himself with the Checker speech. And in 56, when he starts revealing this Howard Hughes loan, that $205,000 loan to his brother, that eventually cost him the 60 campaign, you know. And now here we are, fast forward, about ready to run again in 72, and now he's prepping a news story about two $50,000 cash payments to Rebozo and this secret slush fund. So this is the third time. And he gives some details because he's got the details now. Mayhew's telling him, you know, Mayhew has no reason to keep quiet anymore. You know, before he had to get his information from other sources, but now he's got the man, he's got the guy who was the number two, and he's got documents. And he's publishing these documents, and the documents show that the payments came from the cash pulled from the Silver Slipper Casino. I told you earlier, that's how Howard Hughes paid him. He just went into the casino and skimmed off the top 50,000 one time, 50,000 another. Turns out it came from the Silver Slipper Casino. And on January 24th, 72, Anderson goes further. He's writing a series now, and he claims that he has more documents. In fact, he says he has all the documents. These are supposed to be under court seal in Nevada, he says, but I got them. And of course, this causes a panic in the White House. Nixon, I could just see him muttering that goddamn Hughes thing, that goddamn Hughes thing. He's just shaking his head. And he can't get away from this thing. Hughes is largely responsible financially for all his contributions for Nixon's entire political campaign going back to the mid 40s. But it's one of those gifts. It keeps on giving, and not necessarily in the way that you want it to. You can't get away from it. And Nixon is addicted to the cash. So Hughes just keeps feeding it to him. And as long as Nixon turns around and gets him a few favorable rulings, it's a relationship that's beneficial to both of them. But my God, if the public ever finds out, and you know, the handling of Mayhew, you know, you can make an argument that Hughes bungled this badly, but you know, he doesn't really care. None of this is going to hang him. It's going to hang Nixon. It's not going to hurt Hughes. He might lose his, you know, his politician that he has in his pocket, but he has others, yeah, he can replace him with. But Nixon's got to be furious with the way Hughes handled the Mayhew thing, and of course now Mayhew's feeding all this information to O'Brien. O'Brien is a Democrat Party operative, so coincidentally, and it's not a coincidence, he waits until it's an election year, and then boom, he lays all this information on Jack Anderson. Jack Anderson can't wait to rush to publish everything, and it just hammers Nixon every time. So, by the way, we talked the other day about one of the operation the plumbers was involved in, didn't actually succeed, was to murder Jack Anderson. Now you see why. Okay, now you see why. This probably came straight from Nixon. He's like, we gotta get rid of this son of a, you know, this guy's killing me. He's killing me. February 3rd, 1972, the New York Times gets into the act, and they report that, quote, the biggest collection of Hughes memos obtained from sources very close to Howard Hughes, probably Mayhew, was held by Herman Greenspun, the publisher of the Las Vegas Sun. Oh boy, now we got another problem, because Herman Greenspun owns a newspaper in Las Vegas, and Greenspun is friends with Mayhew and does not like Hughes. So now, if you're Nixon, you're thinking, crap, it's not just Jack Anderson or Drew Pearson. Now I got to worry about Herman Greenspun. And the White House considered Greenspun to be a political ally of Mayhew, and thus an enemy of Hughes and the organization that fired Mayhew. And they realize correctly that Greenspun really doesn't have any axe to grind against Nixon, but he wouldn't hesitate to use these damaging memos to hurt Hughes, which of course would ruin Nixon in the process. So it's spiraling out of control. Mayhew has connections with a lot of people, and a lot of people that can really do damage to the White House. Turns out Greenspun is also close with Jack Anderson. They're both in the same line of work. Anderson's an actual columnist, a writer. Greenspun is a publisher, but they're in the same business and they know each other and they're close. So now they can compare stories. They can compare information. And furthermore, the White House knows because of a personal anecdote where one of the Nixon staffers, the communication director, was once talking to Greenspan or to Greenspun, not Greenspan, Greenspun. And Greenspun tells the Nixon communication director that he knew where the Hughes cash had been going. He said, and this is before all this broke, he had made an offhand comment. Yeah, we know where that money went to, quote, spiff up one of Nixon's personal residences. And so now all of a sudden that Greenspun's name has got thrust into this. The Nixon communication director remembers that conversation. He's like, holy crap, this guy, he already knows, you know, and he already knows where this money's been. He already knows that we've been getting this money and he knows what the money's been going for. So now we come to February 4th, 1972. This is the day after that New York Times story breaks about Greenspun. And Nixon intelligence operative, who's involved with the plumbers at this point, Nixon's, on the side, he's already had the conversation with Helms and he's already hired, he's putting together this special investigative unit to contain all of this. And one of the guys is G. Gordon Liddy, pictured here on the left. E. Howard Hunt is on the right. And on this day, Gordon Liddy proposes a plan to target O'Brien's office for penetration. This is the first time that we know of that G. Gordon Liddy actually vocalizes this idea. We need to get in O'Brien's office and find out what he knows. And as he's talking, the Attorney General, he's the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States, in theory. He's also the chairperson of the Committee to Re-elect the President. And in that capacity, he's worried also about what O'Brien knows and what Greenspun knows. And so he says, well, we don't need to stop with O'Brien. We need to target Greenspun's office as well. Well, and because the two targets have a couple of things in common. Number one, they're both conduits for information that would be devastating. Both information is coming from Mayhew about Hughes and Nixon. And if either one of them takes that information and runs with it, it's going to ruin Nixon. And they both have ties to Jack Anderson, who's the guy who's going to end up writing about all this. So let's cut the head of the snake off. Let's go into these two guys' offices, find out what they know, steal it, so that they can't leak it to Jack Anderson. Maybe we can contain this. Meanwhile, E. Howard Hunt had learned that Greenspun also had information on Ed Muskie, who was at that time the Democrat frontrunner. And, we've already learned that one of the purposes of the plumbers and all of these rat fucking operations was to sabotage the candidates that could beat Nixon and prop up the candidate who can't beat Nixon so that you're left running against George McGovern. In the end, you destroy him. Well, Ed Muskie is the one that they really want to destroy. And Howard Hunt learns that Greenspun also has information on Muskie that he's either hiding or he's sitting on, and it could blow him out of the water. So we need to get our hands on that information because this is the election season. This is the campaign season. And we need to use that information. They're using stuff against us. So it's a game. Both sides are playing. And only one side's playing it legally. I mean, if you really want to be particular about it, it's totally legal for Mayhew to tell what he knows. It's totally legal for him to share the documents that he has. He's no longer under any obligation to hide that for Hughes because he doesn't work for Hughes anymore. And he has information that could hurt Nixon. Well, so be it. He has information that could hurt Hughes. So be it. He's not under any obligation legally not to share that. He can share it with all the people he has, all his contacts. Well, it turns out he has contacts everywhere. He has contacts with Jack Anderson. He has contacts with this guy Greenspun. And so it's not going to be hard to get this information out. So what Nixon's trying to do, what E. Howard Hunt and Liddy are trying to do, is counter that with their own leaks, their own information gathering operation. And Robert Barnett, who is O'Brien's replacement as Howard Hughes's new DC lobbyist, he took over for O'Brien when O'Brien got fired, saw a commonality of interests, quote unquote, with the White House. And so he said, "Hey, Hunt, you just learned that information about Greenspun. You need to share that with Liddy, so that when you guys are planning these break-ins, you can include the Greenspun office as well." So this is where Liddy and Hunt start working together. Okay. Robert Barnett introduces Hunt to Liddy, says, "Hey, he knows something that you need to be aware of. You know something about O'Brien. You want to target O'Brien. He knows something about Greenspun. He wants to target Greenspun. You guys need to work together." And so you can see this whole operation starting to take shape. And this is all in the lead up to the 72 election. Of course, the Watergate burglary happens in June of 72. Now, fast forward, though the Muskie information turned out to be tantalizing, it didn't turn out to be necessary, because they did something else. The rat fucking that came out of the White House took that Ed Muskie stationery and crafted a Canuck letter. And when the New York primary come along and Ed Muskie campaign gets accused of racism against French Canadians as a result of that Canuck letter, Ed Muskie has to drop out. So when Ed Muskie drops out, it's no longer necessary to break into Greenspun's office to get the damaging information on Muskie. And maybe they would have eventually broke into Greenspun's office to get the information that they had from Mayhew about Hughes. But in the meantime, they got busted at Watergate and the whole thing got shut down. So the burglary of Greenspun's office never did happen. So what's the upshot of all this, to summarize all this backstory? Well, the White House was obviously obsessed with O'Brien, and that obsession intensified when they found out that he had a relationship with Robert Mayhew, who was the number 2 in the Howard Hughes business empire, and more specifically to the White House, had been the guy who approved the $100,000 cash payoffs in two $50,000 increments to Rebozo. So they know that Mayhew knows, which if Mayhew knows, they know that O'Brien knows about two $50,000 cash payouts from Howard Hughes to Rebozo, not through official channels, obviously, through private channels, because Rebozo is handling a private slush fund for Nixon. These were not campaign contributions. So that's illegal. They know this. They know that the guy they're running against in 72, O'Brien, who's a Democrat operative and is the head of the DNC, knows this. And he's probably going to use it against them. So the Watergate break-in was really not much about the DNC per se. It was more about O'Brien and what dirt O'Brien had on Nixon. And because Nixon is paranoid, if there's any more stories that come out from Jack Anderson based on this information from O'Brien, I'm screwed. I'm screwed. And so they're trying to figure out a way to contain all this. Jeb Magruder, who was the deputy director of White House communications, said that during a phone call with John Mitchell, who by this time was the committee to reelect the president chairman, and White House Chief of Staff Bob Haldeman, Jeb Magruder said that Haldeman indicated to us that it was important to get as much information about O'Brien, particularly any information that referred to cash that Howard Hughes had supposedly given to Bibi Rebozo and then possibly given to the president. Therefore, the purpose for the break-in and the wiretapping was to find out what information O'Brien knew so that we would be able to keep it under wraps during the election. That kind of sums it up, doesn't it? Kind of sums it up. Frank Sturgis, who was one of the Watergate burglars and a self-confessed CIA assassin, said, quote, "The burglary team was told to look for, quote, anything that had to do with Howard Hughes." Okay. Charles Colson, who was special counsel to the president, was having a conversation with Nixon, said when Nixon lamented to Colson in January 73 that, quote, "we didn't get a goddamn thing from all the campaign spying," Colson replied, "Well, apparently we did. of course, at Watergate, mainly on Hughes. So what he's saying is, we went there to get information. Nixon is admitting the whole thing was about spying, okay, and lamenting the fact that they didn't get what he hoped that they would get. And Colson disagrees and says, "Well, actually, we did. We got some stuff on Hughes, which is why we went there." Uh, so what we find is that the Watergate break-in was a part of an ongoing cover-up by Nixon of a long-standing financial relationship he'd had with Howard Hughes, and the cover-up uh, by the White House of the burglary was really just an extension of the first cover. He'd been covering up his relationship with Howard Hughes forever. And then when the Watergate thing happened, they had to cover that up too, because that added another layer to the Howard Hughes story. In the end, O'Brien never did spill the beans. He didn't have to, because in the wake of the Watergate burglary and all the stuff that we've already learned about, James McCord writing a letter to the judge, the evidence that was found on the burglars, which was highly incriminating, the testimony by John Dean and others. As a result of all that, Congress, a special prosecutor, they all got involved in this investigation. So it's now through official channels. They don't have to go through Jack Anderson and newspapers anymore. Now it's happening through official channels. Even the IRS got involved and began investigating Bebe Rebozo and the trail of cash, trying to find out about that slush fund. Now that got hard because Bebe Rebozo ends up fleeing the country, taking his records, his documents with him, so they couldn't subpoena his records. And remember the advice by Deep Throat was to follow the money. And it got to be hard to follow the money, but investigators were able to determine, they were able to prove it. And really, it didn't come down to proof anyway, because in the end, the impeachment trial never happened. But they were able to establish that more than $45,000 in Hughes cash went to pay for home improvements at Nixon's home in Key Biscayne, which, of course, remember, that's what Greenspun told the White House staffer. He says, we knew what that money went to. Hughes has been giving cash to Nixon to help juice up his house. Another $5,000 went to pay for earrings for Pat on her birthday. Pat was Nixon's wife. And then, according to Rebozo, he passed out some of the cash to Nixon's longtime executive assistant, Secretary Rosemary Woods. If you remember the story, Rosemary, she was the one that they tried to blame the 18.5-minute gap on. They call it the Rosemary stretch, which she's reaching back across her desk to push the phone, a button on the phone. She accidentally pushes a button on the tape recordings for 18.5 minutes, dubs over the most incriminating conversation on the tapes. They call it the Rosemary stretch. Anyway, according to Rebozo, some of that money went to her, went also to Nixon's brothers, Don and Ed. But again, these were all accusations that couldn't be proved because Rebozo fled the country with his records, and so they couldn't be subpoenaed. At the height of Watergate, we're going to learn about E. Howard Hunt, his wife. Later, we're going to learn about this in his blackmail operation. After he gets arrested, he begins blackmail. He and his wife begin blackmail on the White House, saying, "Hey, if you want to keep us quiet, you got to pay us." And the White House was informed, Nixon was informed that it would cost, quote, $1 million to buy the silence of the Watergate burglars. $1 million. And according to John Dean, the lawyer who this is part of the testimony that he tells the committee, the House Judiciary Committee, he says, yeah, we were paying hush money to these burglars. And he says, when I told Nixon it was going to cost $1 million to buy the silence of the Watergate burglars, Nixon was totally unfazed. And he told Dean, quote, you could get $1 million and you could get it in cash. I know where it could be gotten. And he's talking, of course, about Rebozo and that slush fund that had been, Rebozo had been handling that slush fund since '68 when Nixon won his election into the White House. This is 73, 74. This is probably 74 by the time that conversation happens. That was 6 years ago. So there's been a lot of time for a lot of money to accumulate in that tin box that Haldeman was talking about Rebozo was keeping all this cash in for Nixon. So that was the story of the the backstory of the relationship between Nixon and Howard Hughes, which of course we have brought it forward to 74 when all this is starting to come out. But there is another side to the story. This story all started in 45 when Nixon starts running for Congress the first time. And it runs concurrent with another revelation about the Nixon-Howard Hughes relationship that is considerably more sinister. It involves Cuba, Fidel Castro, and an assassination team. And that's the connection that Nixon becomes even more concerned about because it leads back to the JFK assassination. But to begin with that would be negligent because it would make it appear that Nixon, when he goes to Howard Hughes to set up this assassination team, which we're going to start talking about tomorrow, that relationship just started out of clear blue sky. It didn't start out of clear blue sky. This relationship is with Howard Hughes to set up an assassination team to kill Castro is predated, and it's based on a relationship that has been ongoing that they'd had since the mid-40s. That's why he went to Howard Hughes. He trusted Howard Hughes in 1960. Howard Hughes trusted him. They had been working together for a considerable period of time up to that point. So, and he was his off the books power broker, so to speak, for Nixon. And so what we're going to begin talking about tomorrow couldn't be told. That story cannot be told unless you first tell this story and how mutually dependent these two had become by the time 1960 rolls around. So a lot of information there, but basically it's easy to understand. It's Nixon capitalizing on his political career, his name, his position, and Howard Hughes realizing that Nixon is one of these cash-starved politicians. He's always got his hand out. So, he already considered an easy proposition to buy a politician. So Nixon was easy pickings. And that's the relationship between the two. Nixon gets money from Hughes so he can continue his political career, also feather his nest on the side with this secret slush fund, which he's going to use to pay for housing expenses, personal, for gifts for his wife, for the plumbers to keep their silence after they get arrested, for also to pay them for their operations. Who knows how much he paid them before they got arrested. This secret slush fund, there's a lot of cash, all right, flowing through that secret slush fund. And Hughes was largely responsible for that. And then, of course, Hughes, what's he getting out of the deal? His business empire is profiting left and right. Every time he turns around, the IRS, the Department of Treasury, the Attorney General, the Justice Department, I mean, they're all ruling in favor of different ventures helping the Hughes business empire. So both of them are profiting as a result of this relationship. So that is the backstory to what we're going to start talking about tomorrow, which I promise ties back to the JFK assassination. But we had to tell this story first to make tomorrow going forward make any sense. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you feel free to comment, feel free to sign up and subscribe to my channel. It's free. Feel free to hit the notification bell and give me a thumbs up if you like what you're hearing. Like I said, I appreciate everybody's comments. I try to respond when I can. And if I get a free moment during the day, I try to go back and look at comments. I will say, if you comment to a comment, if you reply to one of my comments or reply to somebody else's comments, it doesn't come up for some reason on my phone. I got to go back and in the evenings, take time and kind of search through all the comments to try to respond to people. So sometimes I miss one. I apologize. I don't mean to, but anyway, until next time, I hope everybody has a great day and we'll talk tomorrow. Thank you.